These are images from the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. The women's liberation movement was created by feminists. I've always considered myself a feminist, but as the years have passed, it's been getting harder to find people who describe themselves as feminist. Why is that? There was an unspoken understanding that we had achieved everything, and we didn't need the word feminist anymore.
Women before me had already handled that. Maybe if I was in that time, maybe I would have been stronger on women's rights.
I consider an equalist.
I think the word has become way overblown, and
That's
it
what she's
becomes
saying.
Yeah, and so I don't want to be identified with it.
I never really thought about it too much until one day in 2004, I watched Meet the Press on television. It was Tim Russert and 4 men sitting around a table describing how and if Roe versus Wade could be overturned. That's the Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion in 1973. And I thought, where are the women? Why are there no women at this table discussing Roe versus Wade, reproductive rights? So the next day I talked about it at work, and one woman leaned over and said, "Are you a feminist?" And I don't know why she whispered. And then I replied, "Yes, I am a feminist." And I don't know why I whispered. And then it dawned on me. The whispering of the word feminist has a lot to do with the fact that there were no women at that table. Because when we whisper the word feminist, we reject the great women's liberation movement. Rejecting it helps us to forget it. I tried to tell this woman that it was good to be called a feminist, but I couldn't think of one story from that time to tell her. Why was that? So I began to research what life was like before the women's liberation movement. And I realized that all those feminists that made that revolution happen were all around me, and I could just ask them. So I did. I traveled around the country and I talked to these feminists. I couldn't talk to all of them. That would be impossible. There were so many. But I could talk to some, and I could show people this history. I figured once people saw this film, they would be proud to call themselves a feminist. I thought it would be easy, but it wasn't. The history of the women's movement is more complex than I had originally thought. So I can tell this story as well as I can. And I can pass these stories down to people, including my own daughter. Start with World War II and what life was like before the women's liberation movement.
World War II is a big advance for United States women because it creates jobs. It changed things forever.
Women who used to make their own clothes are now stitching silk and nylon parachutes.
Women had been in the paid labor force in fairly large numbers during World War II and had gotten a taste of autonomy and independence and what they could accomplish.
Instead of cutting out dresses, this woman stamps out the patterns of airplane parts.
But were supposed to get out of that paid labor force and make places for men when they came home, and also become, in the case of the suburbs, educated full-time consumers to take the place of the war engine.
We had provided full child care for all women who worked in those war plants, 24 hours a day, with no cost to them. They had closed all the child care centers as soon as the war was over.
There is a whole new generation coming, soon to be young adults.
Employment for females in those years was completely segregated. We called it occupational segregation.
So if you were a woman looking for a job, and let's say you were a chemist, you would never find a chemist job under help wanted women.
When you married, you took your husband's name, credit rating, legal domicile, social identity. Marriage was legally designed for a person and a half.
You know, women didn't have the opportunity to get the credit in their own name until 1975.
Women were given no information during pregnancy, and I can remember being pregnant and couldn't find anything to read, nothing.
If a teacher became pregnant, they could only work until they showed. Once they showed that they were pregnant, this would shock the children. They were then laid off or fired.
I remember in my law school class, there were men that we would have conversations and arguments about and said that, you know, you're taking places that could go to men who are going to use this law degree. That was open conversation. I don't know many people who had the appropriate feminist consciousness. I know one, Pauli Murray, and I met her at Yale Law School. She, of course, was old enough to be my mother, and she'd come back to get a doctorate of law. And we used to listen to Pauli, and it was interesting. She was unmarried. Most of us wanted to be married. I can't say that the few of us, there were very few women in law school, who listened to her believed, aha, we should be like Pauli. So it really did take more than that. The notion of a feminist revolution, I don't think anybody can honestly say, was on their mind until women began to raise their own consciousness. And who are responsible for the feminist revolution? Not some feminists whose names you know, but they're bubbled up. This sense that could not, this urge that couldn't be resisted.
Now, why didn't I know these stories? Why weren't these stories at the tip of my tongue when I was talking to that woman at work? These stories weren't passed down to me. I was learning them now. The seeds of the women's liberation movement were planted long before women thought a feminist revolution was on the way. Two early events happened: the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women and a book called The Feminine Mystique.
I think very few people know about the Commission on the Status of Women, which truly ignited the women's movement. It wasn't intentional. John F. Kennedy won the presidency by a very slim margin, and Democratic women had helped him tremendously.
Several women, particularly Esther Peterson, who was in the federal government at that point, she called upon President John F. Kennedy to create a commission to study what was happening to women in the society at that time, in the post-war era. And in 1961, he did appoint a commission, and he invited Eleanor Roosevelt to chair that commission.
A group of well-heeled women, well-accomplished women in various states who spent 3 to 5 years researching the status of women.
What they had done is really reveal women's status in America, which was pretty low.
And while they were not radical to start with, they have said to interviewers that they were radicalized by their findings.
I think this is an extremely vital matter with which we're dealing. There used to be an old story that a civilization could be judged on how it treated its elderly people, but I think it can also be judged on its opportunities for women. And like all reports, it will only be important if we can do something about it.
Within a year, that federal commission spawned state commissions all over the United States. And by 1965, these state commissions would have an annual gathering in Washington, D.C., and they would try to make the government understand the issues that were paramount. Most of them had to do with working women. The fact is, the federal government really didn't respond. They took it as a joke, they thought it was silly, and never underestimate humiliation as the source of a major social movement.
Before I talked to Betty Friedan, I was told that she didn't like it if an interviewer hadn't read The Feminine Mystique. So I read it. And then when I showed up for the interview, the first thing she said to me was, "Did you read my book?" And I assured her I had, and she told me her story.
It basically talked about the fact that women who were at home and didn't go to work were dissatisfied, and she pointed up the problems of women who stayed home. Caused a tremendous effect in this country.
After I was fired for being pregnant with my second kid, I freelanced, mostly for Women's Magazine. And I did the alumni questionnaire 15 years out of Smith, my college. This was a time when they were saying, oh, what is wrong with American women? They've had too much education. It keeps them from adjusting to their role as housewives. So I was going to disprove this, that education did make women question their role as women. But it began to seem more and more to me that it was not the education that was the problem, it was the definition of the role of women.
And she created this concept of the feminine mystique. Nobody had ever thought of calling it that before.
I thought when I read her book, it seemed to me to scratch the surface. Women have to be more autonomous, so that you have to go after the church, you have to go after marriage and the family, you have to go after all of these institutions, sexual institutions to conventions, or else you weren't going to really make change.
She did not include African American women. She did not include working women. These were the people she was most concerned with during her adult life.
I could not imagine any woman of color, particularly any black woman, who had ever thought that she was going to just be a housewife, because there was so much discrimination against black people that no family could survive if a black woman did not also work outside the home.
What she was doing was addressing women who wanted and could, in fact, if the doors were open, move into careers.
Betty Friedan books hit me. You know, the ordinary housewife, or whatever you want to call me. Well, maybe I was a young matron, okay? And I knew, it was like I knew it wasn't him, it wasn't me, it was society. And society just had to change.
And this is a period of time, don't forget, that a lot of middle-class families were sending their daughters to college. And she gave it a name, which, as I've said, is the great accomplishment of the women's movement, naming the problem.
And it shows you how important it is to write what you think and to be brave enough to take the brickbats that come back.
You know, the feminine mystique, which I proceeded to demolish, help demolish.
This is one of the things feminism does. It gives you a different perspective through which to see the world. I grew up with this perspective, so it stayed with me. Making a decision to step out of a role that you were expected to be in was a very difficult thing to do in the early 1960s. The mystique that surrounded these housewives locked them into a role from which they could not move. It was kind of like a caste system.
SNCC stands for SNCC, and that stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this was the main Southern student movement in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It was, in many ways, a revolutionary organization in the sense that it was rejecting old mores of one kind or another. It had a different idea about leadership, which was more collective, more democratic. So when, unfortunately, some of the attitudes around women would creep into the organization, there was a little bit of a conflict. Because on the one hand, we're talking about new ways of doing things, new leadership styles, getting rid of racism, not doing the things the same old way, and yet attitudes towards women were there.
I was a volunteer for SNCC in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project of 1964, when about 1,000 students from the North, most of them white, not all of them white, were organized by the SNCC staff people who were out there in the dangerous areas of Mississippi, Negroes, as people called themselves then, were being killed just for registering to vote, and it was getting no media coverage.
When ordinary Americans saw white, young, middle-class kids getting beaten up and taken to jail, it really upset them. It was a brilliant tactic, really, and strategy.
We were living and working in Black communities where the organizers, the backbone of the movement, were women. And the issues about which they were concerned often had to do with needs that were very, very close to communities. There was a conviction that the concerns of women belonged on the agenda of a social justice movement that was already a broad agenda. Now, there had been conversations amongst a small group of women about how do we begin raising this issue that the profound democracy that existed within SNCC and for which we were working, that democratic vision should include the rights of women. And so we wrote a paper which expressed the thinking of a lot of people, and we didn't put our names on it, we just floated it in with all the 200 other papers. Casey and I were afraid that we would be ridiculed if we put our names on that paper. A lot of our fellow SNCC workers were extremely responsive. Some thought it was a diversion and a distraction. 1965, Casey and I wrote another memo, and this time it had our names on it. This was a memo called Sex and Caste. The allusion to a caste system is obvious. It's a strata into which you're born, and nothing that you do can change it.
It was read all over the country. I now look back and think, without email, how did this happen? How did we talk to each other all over the country? But we did. And partly it's because we knew each other somehow from national conventions. We also moved around a lot. And then there was just a lot of organizers who went from city to city and passed out pamphlets and pieces of paper that were mimeographed.
I began to collect these self-published pamphlets. I don't think we forgot the ideas that were printed in them, but I do think we forgot the women who created them. When we think about feminism, we usually think about the National Organization for Women. But even that organization has its roots in something we know very little about, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Suddenly in 1964, before there was an organized women's movement, there was a law on the books that prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, race, and religion, and gender. The legislation was called Title VII. It was one piece of a very large Civil Rights Act that then President Johnson got through.
The law, when it was originally projected for Congress, was what I would call a traditional civil rights law. And that was that it barred discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, national origin, or ancestry. There was no sex in it. Some people decided that it might be a good point to include sex discrimination. And Martha Griffiths decided that there ought to be an amendment. So she talked to some people about it, and she did introduce this. And it was also introduced by Howard Smith, congressman from Virginia, who couldn't have cared less about women or about the civil rights movement. In fact, I think he wanted to see that law go down the drain. But he agreed to introduce the amendment.
Nobody was going to get up and say, take that out. We don't want to prohibit sex discrimination. Except there were women working against it. Esther Peterson, Mary Kaiserling, women who came out of the labor movement. They thought that sex discrimination in employment should be handled by a separate statute. Pauli Murray worked on the Hill to keep that language in.
Most of the men thought it was a joke. They talked about Playboy bunnies being males, and that would not be exactly what the United States wanted. But it got passed. And out of it came the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
But the EEOC, which was the enforcement agency, thought that that was a silly addition they didn't have to pay any attention to. And so one of the first fights of the women's movement was to get the EEOC to enforce the law as it was written.
The EEOC altogether at that time consisted of about 100 permanent and temporary employees. Most of them were there because they wanted to fight discrimination against African Americans. They were not interested, by and large, in doing anything about the sex discrimination prohibition. Eileen Hernandez was for women's rights, Dick Graham was for women's rights. Sam Jackson was sympathetic because he thought about black women whom he knew. And but I wasn't on that level that I could do anything. They were commissioners.
Eileen Hernandez and Sam Jackson were kindred spirits, and they were feisty and determined.
During the first year of the commission's operations, 37% of the complaints filed alleged sex discrimination. So my boss began to call me a sex maniac, Charlie Duncan, because whatever was going on, I would say, what about sex discrimination? So he called me a sex maniac.
We had a lot of cases that came in from stewardesses almost immediately. Airlines in those days had policies about the flight attendants. One of them was that you could not be married and be a flight attendant. Another one was you couldn't be over a certain age and be a flight attendant.
Hello there. Are you sitting in 2D? Yes, 2D. Take your coat, okay?
You had to be beautiful, and you had to be skinny, and you had to have all of those other things going for you. The airlines decided that they would ask for an exemption to the law. So the EEOC said they would take under consideration this issue of the flight attendant's job being a female-only job.
Glamour job. Mary Ann has made dozens of runs like this, served hundreds of hot meals.
Well, the help wanted newspaper ads in those days were in columns, and they were help wanted male and help wanted female. Or let's say you're an accountant. You've gone all the way through school and you're now a CPA. So you look for a CPA job. You look in the help wanted female columns, there are no CPA jobs. There are bookkeeper jobs. All the CPA jobs are in the male column.
So what if you were a woman and just went to the male column?
Well, then you would go to the column, but you also obviously looked at it and said, well, it says it's a help wanted male. They're not going to hire me. And that's usually what happened, because when somebody went down and said, well, I saw your ad, and they said, oh, you saw our ad where? And it was in this paper, and it was in the help wanted male column. Well, we were looking for men for this job. So the EEOC made a decision that it would not be considered a violation of the law against the newspaper to have help wanted male and female columns. Dr. Pauli Murray, she said that's insane. What really needs to happen is that women need to organize in some way, because if they don't organize for their own rights, it just isn't going to happen.
And I said, well, golly, we have to have some means of support on this, because there is no great groundswell of opinion in favor of equal rights for women.
Betty Friedan came to the EEOC. She said to me, what are the problems here? What are the conflicts? What's wrong? And I took her in my office and I started to cry. And I said, what this country needs is an organization to fight for women.
The National Organization for Women was a bold step for women in the 1960s.
Feminism was a bad word. The existing women's organizations were kind of brainwashed. So they had to say, I'm not a feminist, but. You know, AAUW, League of Women Voters.
I went to the heads of the three women's organizations, and they said, well, we can't take a stand on issues, you know.
They weren't supposed to be political.
So Betty Friedan called a meeting in her hotel room and said, I think we need an NAACP for women. These commissions on the status of women, not going to do it.
And 28 women altogether signed up for now, and each one gave $5, as I recall.
We had a Monsignor on the board. We had several nuns on the board. We had women from all kinds of academic backgrounds on the board. We had created a statement of purpose of NOW by that time, which was written mostly by Betty Friedan, but along with her, key parts of that were also written by Pauli Murray, which connected the women's movement to the full movement for human rights.
And the time has long since come for us to confront the conditions that prevent women from really taking a fully equal place in American society.
I never gave a lecture without leaving a NOW chapter behind, and I'd say, call a press conference, do this, do that. They'd never been to a press conference, much less call one.
So at one point, we began to meet in Mary Eastwood's apartment, and I would tell them, now this is not proper to do, and I usually do the legal thing and the right thing, but in this instance of my life, I did not. I would tell them what was happening at the EEOC that I felt was egregious as far as women were concerned. And we would draft a letter on behalf of NOW to the EEOC. And we would say, why aren't you doing this? Why didn't you do that? Why aren't you doing this? And we would send that letter to the commission. And nobody at the commission ever said, how do these people know what we're doing in our innermost commission meetings? Never came up.
The largest, best organized, best known group is NOW, mostly business and professional women. NOW meetings look interchangeable with the PTA. They aren't. They discuss how to liberate a men's bar and grill and ways in which to get Title VII of the Civil Rights Act fully enforced.
So I said I would be glad to be Pacific Coast Vice President. Dick Graham was the East Coast Vice President. So two members formerly on the EEOC were executive officers of the founding of NOW at that stage of the game.
NOW really got the EEOC to begin implementing the law because NOW filed lawsuits, NOW got publicity, NOW picketed the White House and the EEOC, and the EEOC began to enforce the law.
It was wonderful to meet other people who thought there was some problem about how women were treated. And all of those women, even to this day, there is something bedrock about them. They really are stone feminists.
I was like a red flag, a red, blanket for a bull. I would walk in and everyone would go bananas. The guys thought we were, gonna overturn their lives, which in some ways we did. And many, many women, probably most women in those days, thought we were really something to stay away from.
Listen to your enemy, because your enemy is going to tell you what's important. Like when we would picket against segregation of help wanted ads.
A paper like the New York Times, which carries the most of the advertising for employment, that they will continue to be able to pay half pay to women, and they would be able to that way make a much higher profit at the expense of over half the population.
People would come up and say, you must be lesbian. And you'd say, what? Where did that come from? What is that? Well, they're trying to tell you that that is what they're afraid of.
There were a lot of women involved in the early days of NOW who didn't agree on all of the issues.
NOW at that time was very old-fashioned, formal.
There were other groups outside of NOW, radical women, lesbian groups. And so I put a panel together, is lesbianism a feminist issue? We were mobbed. We had about 300 people at that meeting, where normally we might have 50. But then I started to hear that Betty Friedan was furious. So I thought, well, I can't take it back. And frankly, I wouldn't have, because it was only fair. These women in the chapter, working their hearts out, were hiding who they were.
And they felt that lesbians were active in the women's movement and should be recognized as such.
NOW got the bad press of being a Dykes organization.
And Betty Friedan, who was not herself a lesbian, became very concerned about that. And she thought at that point that the movement and that now and the whole feminist movement would be ruined.
Lots of us thought it was going to be very, very difficult because we were just being accepted as a feminist organization, and we didn't know if this was going to change things. So Betty was not popular at all.
Betty Friedan decided that we were going to have a meeting and have a vote that the lesbians would be expelled from now. And Kate Millett was at that group. And Kate Millett is a great genius. Kate Millett stood up and said, fine, let's have a vote, but let's not have it by secret ballot. Let's have it by a show of hands. They couldn't do it, and so it didn't pass. And that, to me, was a wonderful lesson.
And it was a time of movements, of feeling we were fighting for a better society, on civil rights, on the war in Vietnam, about student rights on campus, about democracy itself.
Many women who were in the civil rights movement were also in the anti-war movement.
Actually, Liberation Magazine took the lead in organizing a conference between Americans from the peace movement and Vietnamese from North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. I was married at the time, and so it was either my husband or myself who got to go, and we decided I should go. The conference was in Czechoslovakia, and we heard all kinds of testimony from Vietnamese about what the American strategy was and what the bombing raids were like in North Vietnam. I was invited to be in an all-women's group with women from North and South Vietnam who wanted to talk about the special oppression and suffering that women were experiencing. They talked with us about women being raped and being parachuted into GI camps to be used as prostitutes, and tortures, horrible tortures that women experienced. And one of the women there, I asked her to make a tape for me, a message to American women.
Our American sisters, many courage and good success in your fight for a better life and racial equality and quick end to the Vietnam War.
And then following that conference, Tom was invited to put a group together to go to North Vietnam. Carol McEldowney and myself went. The only reason there were women on this delegation is that the Vietnamese insisted that there be women. Carol and I met separately with the Women's Union there and heard presentations about how they built their organization, how they built leadership amongst women, and they saw themselves as organizers of women. That was their role. They felt they represented half of the population and they needed to mobilize people. They wanted to talk about what we were going to do when we got back to the United States to help them end the war. I'd never thought about us. I always thought of us as sort of secondary to men. But it was clear if the Vietnamese didn't insist on it, there wouldn't have been any women on the trip. Came back to the United States with just this enormous sense of responsibility. There was a women's group that had started in Chicago. I met with them and shared this experience I had. So we decided to use their example as a way to build an independent women's movement in Chicago. You know, and it was the beginning of the women's liberation movement.
People get confused, partly because of the nature of this society and how it wants you to think that everything's done by individuals and that everything can be patented, everything's private property. So somebody developed this idea. No. Social movements, in fact, things happen because things are happening all over, all kinds of people. Shifts are happening in people's brains. I knew, you know, when I started organizing in New York, then I traveled, right? Other women, I mean, people were already meeting in Chicago. The poor women in New Rochelle and Mount Vernon had already been meeting. People were meeting all over the place.
Here is a feminist story not well known. Jeanette Rankin, the Republican congresswoman from Montana, led an anti-war brigade in 1968.
Jeanette Rankin Brigade was organized to be a women's march against the war in Vietnam, a women's march for peace. It was not a march of women for women's rights or for women's liberation. Those terms were tiny little seeds out there that some of us knew about. They certainly weren't public concepts at that point. We considered these peace women, women radicals, because they were playing on the stereotype of women as being more peaceful than men, and of course that women should be more peaceful, they should never fight for things they need to fight for. We felt this would be a good occasion to start raising the issues of women's liberation. It was the first joint action of New York radical women and Chicago radical women. I was kind of chosen by New York radical women, which represented the more feminist speech even then than the Chicago radical women. I mean, there was a conflict. They didn't even like to use the word feminism. We were into rehabilitating the word feminism. We said, if we're going to be able as women to end the war, we're not going to be able to do that from the powerless position we're now in society. We staged a mock funeral of traditional womanhood.
Now, some of the older women thought, this is not such a great idea. These women are burying traditional womanhood, which has given us the right to, in fact, protest against the war. Some of the younger women argued, we're not protesting against the war as women anymore. We're protesting against the war because we have the right to as citizens of the United States. Actually, going home on planes and trains, everybody talked about that. They talked about the differences, they talked about the positives, the negatives, and what it did is it in many ways helped bring together the generations because the differences had been, in fact, illustrated at that Jeanette Rankin Brigade.
At this point, feminism was clearly moving beyond the economic issues that the National Organization for Women was tackling. Young feminists were using words like patriarchy and male chauvinism. These feminists wanted to reshape the system to include women equally. This is why feminism is threatening, because if you're benefiting from the society as it is, why change it?
The Betty Friedans and the people dealing with the Stats Wound Commission and the EEOC are older. They're in their 50s. The peace movement brings in all these students, and it brings in women's liberation. The men were being, as I said about my husband, in a life and death situation. They had to make a decision if they got drafted. If they went into the war, they could be killed. Otherwise, there was a good chance they were going to jail.
Friends from the Boston Draft Resistance Group, they're here to help us and give us aid in the legal ramifications.
Women, simply by that material reality, were always going to be second-class citizens in that group.
Who in the movement wanted to go and work constantly in an anti-war movement where men treated them like little dolls or cute sex partners?
There was the drug revolution with both the good and the bad. The good in that it freed things up. Not so good for women, who were often lured into situations like Altamont or Woodstock and without being told were given LSD and then gang raped. And there was a dark underside to the happy hippie flower child revolution. But the one consistent throughout all of this was guys controlled it. There were a few token women. The general treatment of all women, you were either attached to a man, you were the appendage of, or you just weren't very important. You weren't very important even if you were an appendage.
The civil rights movement had stirred up the whole society. The student movement had given a lot of other women political leadership on the campuses, so there was a lot of turmoil. And of course, you know, in France, students were trying to take over the government. It just felt like the whole world was being transformed.
When I was a student at the university, A friend of mine was raped at knife point in her bed in off-campus housing. And she went to student health service for a gynecological exam, and we went with her. And first she was given a lecture on her promiscuity, and then she was also told that student health didn't cover gynecological exams. I mean, that's part of what life was like before there was a women's movement. Now, because there had been a civil rights movement, we sat with her, and people called it a sit-in.
There began to be these little burps. The mud pools go boop, 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 boop. Women in SDS formed a caucus, and they were pelted at an SDS convention with tomatoes and then raw eggs and then rocks. The rage that women in the New Left felt, whether they were political women like me because we were tired of making coffee and not making policy. We were tired of coming home from demonstrations and having the guy we were with say, well, man, generic man, we were all man, that was heavy, and lying down and getting stoned on the sofa while we then went into the kitchen and made dinner, wiping the same tear gas from our eyes that he was wiping from his. And the bitterness came from the disillusionment that thought we were all marching arm in arm to the brave new revolutionary future and finding that it was a male revolutionary future and we weren't included.
Gradually, those women got so alienated from the anti-war movement, they began to form small consciousness-raising groups in which they began to talk about what's wrong with me? Where is it written in the Bible that I have to clean the toilet? Is that the 11th commandment? Or why is it that I have to take care of the baby and stay home while he goes out to save the world?
Now, this is perhaps the most powerful part of the women's movement, and it's also the quietest. I didn't come to this conclusion quickly. It took me a long time to see it. It's really important to talk with other women, but more importantly, listening to them.
Apartment, we can't find a place for you.
Consciousness raising was a method of finding out the truth about women's lives.
Consciousness-raising ideas really began in New York radical women, although I will say that's another concept that came from the civil rights movement, because those of us who were in the civil rights movement saw how powerful it was when the SNCC organizers would go into churches and they would stand up and they would talk about their experiences, would evoke other people to stand up, and it would arouse people's anger and courage.
We developed a set of, you could call them rules, so that everybody got to speak. Nobody was allowed to interrupt. Nobody was allowed to challenge the testimony of anybody else. Non-hierarchical, of course, no leaders.
Oh, they were really quite wonderful. Just the coming together of women to talk was just so powerful. I always say I was real fortunate because I got to sit among my white sisters and do consciousness raising as well as the black sisters. You got to see what life was like among other people. You got to look into other women's lives.
Unionized. You're the first person who's fired.
Really specific topics. You know, like maybe at one meeting we talked about our mothers and our relationship with our mothers. Another meeting we talk about our fathers.
If a topic was a good one, it would go on for 6, 8, 10 weeks on a single topic, week after week.
Subservient to some man and to his children, and that I had to do the cooking and the cleaning and the taking care of the house.
One of those topics was sex. You can imagine. Women were not allowed to talk about sex among themselves before the women's movement. It was a taboo subject. Abortion was taboo. Nobody ever talked about that. If you talked about your husband, you were being disloyal. That was taboo. You weren't allowed to take it out of the family. And so we were trying to break all of those taboos and tell and try to get some new knowledge.
Personal issues you were suffering alone and in isolation and in privacy that you thought were your fault, that you weren't smart enough, you weren't good enough, you weren't pretty enough. And that's why fill in the blank, something wasn't working. That's why a relationship didn't work or you didn't advance on the job. In fact, it was shared by other women. And so shared, it was a social problem. And as a social problem, also needed a social solution.
A group of us having a consciousness-raising group in 1966 at Cornell University discovered, 11 of us, that 11 of us out of 11 of us had loved mathematics as teens, and that not one of us had pursued mathematics as college students. In another era, we would have said, well, I guess we just didn't like it well enough, or I guess we weren't good enough. But with the consciousness-raising skills that we were developing, we began to realize that something was going on here that was outside of us, that we were internalizing some notion that women can't do mathematics. And then you go to the next political question, which is, okay, somebody's persuading us that women don't do mathematics. Who wins in such a circumstance and who loses?
You can't see consciousness raising as a destination. It really is a part of a very powerful journey that really lasts as long as you live. And we should have looked at them as keeping groups together as long as people live and can come together, or have it so that you could go to any city and join an ongoing group, et cetera, you know? It just, we would have a powerful force of women, and we wouldn't have all this disconnect between what happened and what really happened, because people wouldn't know it. It would be more, it would be ingrained. It would be within the fabric of their lives and of their consciousness.
I talked with Frances Beale and Petita Martinez about class, race, and the women's movement.
Throughout the 80s, there was a lot of stuff on race and gender. And when I would talk to a lot of white women, they would just say, oh, well, there was a lot of racism there. And then as I started to read, and I realized how many African-American women and women of color were involved in the women's movement, I was stunned that I didn't know this information. And it amazed me.
Well, that's a product of the racism even, you know, so that they were able, those are people who are opposed to the advancement of women or to women's liberation or the equality of women, used race relations which are very bad in this country as a way of separating and dividing women. Now, the reason why some of this was very successful is because racism actually did exist and does exist and continues to exist in the women's movement. And part of that gets articulated by, in particular, I think, by white women who assume that their issues and the way they see their issues of gender oppression and liberation is the way all women see it or should see it.
You don't understand exactly how I have to help you, though. Well, look, honey, just between you and me, I'm black. And that means double trouble.
You had class and race operating as negative forces within the women's liberation movement.
Are the two entwined?
Are they really entwined? Of course, but they weren't discussed that way.
Why are they entwined?
Why are they entwined? My God. Okay. Well, clearly, both are forces that denigrate huge populations. You can't just be a woman of color and just be a woman or just be of color. You're both things together.
The SNCC Black Women's Liberation Committee was founded coming out of a SNCC meeting. We did a presentation, and some of the aspects of that paper had to do with the forced sterilization of black women, particularly in the South, the right to abortion, which there was a lot of debate, and the role of women should be an equal one. And many people said, yeah, but this is a divisive thing, and we shouldn't be doing this. The most important thing is the anti-racist struggle. Now, you have to remember, this is already 1968 by this time. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had already passed. What was emerging now were other types of struggles, economic issues, the war in Vietnam. There were debates about whether class or race was the most important or whether it was an amalgam. We added gender oppression to it, and therefore we got triple oppression, race, class, and gender. That was the first articulation, was through the SNCC Black Women's Liberation Committee.
Another issue very threatening to people, women's reproductive capacities. Why is that? It's like a corner we're expected to run to, and then we're expected to be happy with whatever is given to us.
To the assumption.
We'd already started with consciousness raising, and we'd learned the power, even among ourselves, to hear, oh my God, you also had an abortion? Some women had had babies and given them up for adoption and had never talked about it before. So we learned in those how powerful it might be to talk about this publicly. Well, there was this hearing, whether or not to reform the abortion laws.
They were holding an abortion hearing in New York City, 9 men and 1 woman who was a nun.
We knew we were for repealing the laws. We shouldn't be like begging if you've been raped, you could have an abortion.
And Kathy and the Redstockings, they put out the call, let's go and break it up. So first we sat in and we listened to them a while, and then Kathy got up and said, what right do you, 9 men and 1 woman, a nun, have to decide whether it's okay for a woman to have an abortion? So they put us out. And of course, we demonstrated outside. It made the news.
Redstockings did a few actions to challenge some of the taboos and stigma about abortion, too, by speaking out.
Anybody, because it was all right to be, sleeping with somebody. That's fine. But when you get pregnant, then there's something wrong with you.
You're probably wondering why you haven't seen Gloria Steinem yet. Well, she doesn't even enter the picture until this point in the history.
It really took my listening to the first women who were coming out of the movements that were most important to us, the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and saying, look, if even in these very admirable, wonderful, important movements, women are still not treated equally, something's really wrong. We need an autonomous women's movement. And it was that, plus, in my case, going to an abortion hearing. And that really made the difference to me, because I had had an abortion and not told anyone. So when I listened to women talking about having had a then criminalized abortion, I thought, why? Why is it illegal? And that began to unravel everything.
Suddenly, Gloria Steinem appeared on the scene as a leader who hadn't come from any of the groups.
She was a reporter. She immediately got all the attention and was able to start a magazine in the movement's name because she could raise the money, because she had friends in high places.
She was coming in on the popularity that had already been created by our access to the media. And we were like popularizing it, even though we were only grassroots women, that we had been able to get access. Of course, we wouldn't have gotten access if the civil rights movement hadn't happened and if people hadn't died to get media access to this kind of thing. I mean, media access is this really tricky thing. You have to usually fight for it, then you get it, then it gets taken away, then you somehow get it back.
But I think she has earned her stripes. Very much.
Even though feminists were dealing with very serious issues, they used their sense of humor a lot.
We've got a lot of the same enemies, but only time is going going to tell whether we'll work together or not. Look, they'll try and buy you off. They'll tell you you're better than us. You'll figure it out. If you're as dumb as they treat you, you wouldn't remember how to breathe. I've got a meeting to go to. See you later.
Guerrilla theater was a real contribution, I think, of the younger women who entered the movement through student rights movement and SNCC and SDS and all those.
And the women's liberationists all tended to be much younger, which I think helped rehabilitate feminism, because there was this image in people's minds of the little old lady with tennis shoes as the only feminists who were still around, and now had a little of that image because they were older women. We were going to be the radical feminists, and we were all young, which surprised people.
I think I was an activism junkie. I had come from the civil rights movement and the New Left, and I still had that sort of leftist, yippee, let's do something about it, let's just not sit and talk, which was kind of, I think, a reflection of the male politics of the time. They said we were just women sitting and talking. I wanted a little male approval. And we formed this little activist group, and I came up with WITCH. And the anagram was Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell.
Ma'am, what is the organization WITCH here?
The initials WITCH stand for the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. It's the striking arm of the women's liberation movement.
Now, what are you seeking to liberate?
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
What are you seeking to liberate?
We're trying to liberate women from the kinds of stereotyped roles that they've been put in by the society.
We demonstrated in front of the stock exchange, and meanwhile came by at 4 o'clock in the morning and poured crazy glue in the locks, and then came back at 9 a.m. and cast spells and hexes. And of course the doors, which at that point had real locks and were these huge brass doors, wouldn't open because so it looked as if the hex worked, made lots of headlines. At that point, the media was already saying feminists have no sense of humor. They loved us, and we were able to get our message across. Well, it took off so much that there began to be little witch covens that sprang up all around the country, completely unconnected to us. They used the anagram differently. There was a group of women who did a wildcat strike at the telephone company, and their group was called WITCH, Women Incensed at Telephone Company Harassment.
The witches materialize at demonstrations. They perform guerrilla theater. They emerge just to harass.
New York radical women decided to make an action to protest the Miss America pageant, to protest women being judged by beauty exclusively.
Girls from each of the states parade before a capacity crowd at the Atlantic City Auditorium.
And we all climbed into the buses and we sang all the way, and we got to Atlantic City. We started demonstrating.
#1 piece of prime American property. She sings in the kitchen, hums at the typewriter.
It was such a nexus of sexism, obviously, objectification, racism. At that point, there had never been a black Miss America. It was commercialism, obviously, because she shilled products. And it was militarism, because Miss America always is sent to wherever the troops are.
And they were yelling at us, the men, "Oh, none of you could be Miss Beauty Queen, you're ugly." And there were really some beautiful women there, so come on.
4 or 5 women went in ladies' drag. In other words, little skirts and little gloves, and we bought them tickets and they went inside. The pageant, you have to understand, was live.
Meanwhile, Miss West Virginia is rounding those last curves to capture...
They were in the balcony, and they had secreted under their coats panels
which said nothing but women's liberation.
They unfurled the banner over the balcony. And of course, all the cameras. And then they went to commercial, and the women were arrested and carted off.
We couldn't get a permit to have a fire on the boardwalk, so instead we had a Freedom trash can. We never did burn bras, but our intention was to burn bras, to tell you the truth.
1970, the ideas that Betty Friedan talked about in the feminine Mystique and the ideas we talked about in women's liberation, we knew we could hit a chord and get a response, but there wasn't a national explosion. And the breadth of the movement was clear once the women's strike was called.
And Betty Friedan was telling everybody 50,000 were going to march. How we're going to make it happen?
So if we're going to make a statement, let's make a big one. Let's take over the Statue of Liberty.
And they measured the wind factor at the top of the statue. And they went into someone's loft and they made two 40-foot banners. The one at the bottom was going to say March on August the 26th. And the one at the top was going to say, Women of the World Unite.
I said, how are we going to get this over on the boat? And they said, well, we're going to cut it in pieces and put grommets on it. And then we're going to wrap each piece around a woman's body and put a maternity blouse on her.
So sure enough, when we got there, they took the guys on the side, the guards, and they were talking. We ran up the stairs while the women downstairs were preparing to do the demonstration when the signs went up. We barely got in because the guards caught on and they started chasing us, and we were slamming the door trying to keep them while we put the sign out. And then the mayor called. It was Mayor Lindsay. And he said, let the women alone. That picture of the Statue of Liberty, Women of the World Unite, went around the world.
You know, you think back on these events, they have worldwide importance.
We know from our own time what women have done. But for every known woman leader like myself, there are thousands of others over the years that are not known. And future generations of scholars will have to unbury that history.
Did we forget these stories, or did we think they were unimportant? I talked to so many feminists. There are more stories to tell. Now that I know these stories, I can pass them down to people, including my own daughter. And she won't have to whisper the word feminist, because she'll know it. It will be ingrained. It will be in her consciousness.
Shine your shoes.